The gavel struck sharply against the judge's bench, silencing the murmurs in the courtroom. Ethan sat rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden table. Across the room, Vanessa stood, her polished appearance a stark contrast to the turmoil in her eyes. "The evidence is clear," the judge began, their voice heavy with authority. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, every beat a reminder of how far he had come. The room seemed to fade as memories of the past 3 years washed over him, memories of humiliation, betrayal, and a resilience he never thought he possessed. This was it, the moment that would decide not just his future, but also the narrative of his life. 3 years earlier, Ethan had believed his life was as close to perfect as it could get. He and Vanessa had been married for 5 years, their relationship built on a shared dream of success and stability. While Vanessa climbed the corporate ladder with relentless ambition, Ethan pursued his passion for woodworking, running a small business from their garage. At social gatherings, Vanessa often introduced Ethan with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "This is my husband, Ethan," she would say. "He's a craftsman, a very talented one." The tone was polite, but the subtle undercurrent of dismissal was impossible to ignore. Ethan laughed it off, telling himself it didn't matter. Vanessa's career demanded a polished image, and he wasn't part of that world. But the cracks in their marriage became more evident over time. Vanessa's late nights at the office turned into weekends away for networking events. When Ethan brought up his concerns, she dismissed them with a wave of her hand. "You wouldn't understand, Ethan," she said once, her voice sharp. "You've never had to compete in a world like mine." The humiliation reached its peak during an elegant dinner party hosted by one of Vanessa's colleagues. Ethan had spent hours preparing, wanting to look his best. But as they entered the sprawling home, the weight of Vanessa's world pressed down on him. The guests were all sharp suits and designer dresses, their conversations peppered with jargon Ethan didn't understand. Vanessa stuck close to her boss, laughing at his jokes and nodding at his every word. Ethan tried to mingle, but each interaction left him feeling smaller. At one point, someone asked what he did for a living. "He makes furniture," Vanessa said before Ethan could respond. "It's a hobby of his." The room filled with polite chuckles, and Ethan's face burned. He excused himself, retreating to the terrace where the cool night air did little to soothe his anger. Vanessa found him moments later, her smile tight. "Don't take it so personally," she said. "They're just trying to relate." "Relate?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "You made me sound like a joke, Vanessa." "I didn't mean it that way," she said, brushing him off. "Why are you being so sensitive?" The night of the dinner party marked a turning point for Ethan. He began noticing the ways Vanessa minimized his contributions, both in public and at home. She never asked about his work or the clients who admired his craftsmanship. When Ethan showed her a new design he was particularly proud of, she barely glanced at it. "That's nice," she said absently, scrolling through her phone. Ethan's self-doubt grew, but so did his determination to prove his worth. He threw himself into his work, taking on more clients and expanding his portfolio. But no matter how much success he achieved, it felt invisible next to Vanessa's towering career. The divide between them widened. Ethan began spending more time in his workshop, finding solace in the rhythmic sound of sanding wood and the smell of freshly cut lumber. It was the only place where he felt in control, where he could create something tangible and beautiful amidst the chaos of his personal life. One evening, as Ethan worked late in his workshop, a familiar ping echoed from Vanessa's laptop on the kitchen counter. She had forgotten to close her email. Ethan ignored it at first, but the subject line of one message caught his eye: funds transfer confirmation. Curiosity turned to dread as Ethan clicked on the email. The details were explicit: large sums of money moved from a joint account he hadn't even known existed. The recipient was a name he didn't recognize, and the purpose was vague: consultancy fees. Vanessa walked in moments later, her face turning pale as she saw Ethan staring at the screen. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. She hesitated, then straightened her posture. "It's business, Ethan. Something you wouldn't understand." "Business?" he repeated, his disbelief morphing into anger. "You're stealing from us." "It's not stealing," Vanessa snapped. "It's an investment. For our future." "Our future?" Ethan said, his voice rising. "You've been lying to me, Vanessa. About everything." That night, Ethan slept in the workshop, the warmth of the wood offering little comfort. For the first time, he realized just how broken their marriage had become, and how much he had been willing to ignore. The morning after the discovery, Ethan sat in his workshop, staring blankly at an unfinished chair. The sound of birds outside the window contrasted sharply with the storm raging inside him. Vanessa had left early for another meeting, her cool demeanor making it clear she had no intention of addressing the issue. Ethan's mind replayed the events of the previous night. Every lie, every dismissal, every moment she'd made him feel small, all of it felt like a weight he could no longer bear. For years, he had allowed himself to believe that keeping the peace was worth the sacrifice of his dignity. Now, he knew better. By the time Vanessa returned that evening, Ethan had packed a suitcase. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice firm but calm. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting such resolve. "I'll stay with a friend for now," Ethan added. "I need space to think." Vanessa didn't argue, her silence speaking volumes. Ethan moved into a spare room at his friend Paul's house, a quiet refuge that gave him the space to process everything. Paul, a longtime confidant, listened without judgment as Ethan recounted the years of feeling invisible in his own marriage. "You've been carrying this for too long," Paul said one evening, handing Ethan a cup of coffee. The workshop became Ethan's sanctuary. He poured his emotions into his work, creating intricate designs that reflected his turmoil and determination. Each piece he crafted felt like a small victory, a reminder of his ability to build something meaningful from nothing. One day, Paul suggested Ethan showcase his work at a local artisan fair. "You've got talent, Ethan," Paul said. "People need to see it." Though hesitant at first, Ethan agreed. He needed to prove, if only to himself, that he was capable of standing on his own. The fair was bustling with vendors and visitors, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread and sawdust. Ethan's booth, a modest display of hand-carved furniture and decorative pieces, drew a steady stream of admirers. For the first time in years, Ethan felt seen, not as Vanessa's husband, but as a craftsman with a unique vision. A young woman lingered at his booth, tracing her fingers over the smooth edge of a walnut table. "This is incredible," she said, her eyes lighting up. "Do you take custom orders?" Ethan's heart swelled at the compliment. "Yes, I do," he replied, handing her a business card. By the end of the day, he had not only sold several pieces but also gained a handful of new clients. The experience reignited a spark within him, a reminder of who he was before Vanessa's criticisms had dulled his confidence. Ethan's newfound sense of purpose was soon tested when Vanessa filed for divorce. The papers arrived one crisp morning, delivered by a courier who barely met Ethan's eyes. Leafing through the documents, Ethan was struck by the coldness of Vanessa's demands. She sought to claim a significant portion of his workshop's earnings, despite her dismissive attitude toward his work during their marriage. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, but Ethan knew he had to approach the situation with clarity. He hired a lawyer, a sharp and empathetic woman named Claire, who listened intently as he explained the situation. "She's trying to discredit me," Ethan said, frustration evident in his tone. "But I won't let her." The divorce proceedings began in earnest, with Vanessa's legal team painting her as the primary breadwinner and Ethan as a dependent. It was humiliating, but Ethan stood his ground, determined to show the court and himself that he was far more than Vanessa's narrative suggested. The courtroom was cold, the sterile atmosphere amplifying Ethan's anxiety. Vanessa sat across from him, poised and unyielding. Her lawyer launched into a prepared statement, portraying her as a hardworking professional who had supported Ethan's hobby. But Claire was ready. She presented evidence of Ethan's thriving business, including testimonials from satisfied clients and images of his best work. The turning point came when Claire introduced financial records that revealed Vanessa's secretive transfers. "These funds," Claire said, her voice steady, "were taken without Mr. Davis's knowledge, undermining the financial trust of the marriage." Vanessa's calm facade cracked. She avoided eye contact with Ethan, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of her actions shift away from him. This wasn't just about a failing marriage, it was about reclaiming his identity and integrity. The courtroom battles stretched on for weeks, each session bringing new tensions and revelations. Vanessa's legal team argued that Ethan's workshop's success was built on the stability her income had provided. Without her, they claimed, he wouldn't have had the freedom to pursue his craft. Ethan clenched his fists beneath the table, anger simmering. But Claire remained calm. "Mr. Davis's craft is his livelihood, not a hobby," she said, presenting records of Ethan's steady income and glowing reviews from clients. "He has created a self-sustaining business that reflects his dedication and talent." Ethan felt a flicker of hope as the judge nodded, taking notes. Each piece of evidence Claire presented chipped away at Vanessa's narrative, and for the first time Ethan began to believe that the truth could prevail. One evening, after a grueling day in court, Ethan returned to Paul's house and found himself staring at an old photo of him and Vanessa. It had been taken during their honeymoon, a time when they were full of hope and shared dreams. His chest tightened as he wondered how everything had gone so wrong. Paul noticed Ethan's silence and joined him on the porch. "You know, it's okay to feel this," Paul said gently. "Anger, sadness, it's all part of letting go." Ethan nodded, his voice cracking as he replied, "I just don't understand how she could betray me like this. I gave everything to that marriage." "You did," Paul said, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "But now it's time to give to yourself. You've spent years proving your worth to someone who didn't see it. Maybe it's time to stop proving and start living." The next court session brought an unexpected twist. Claire had uncovered evidence that Vanessa's financial transfers weren't just hidden, they were linked to dubious investments that had no returns. Mrs. Davis knowingly placed joint funds into high-risk ventures without consulting Mr. Davis, Claire said, her voice steady. Vanessa's lawyer tried to dismiss the claims, but the judge's expression grew stern. "This is a serious breach of trust," the judge said, addressing Vanessa directly. "Can you explain why these actions were taken?" Vanessa hesitated, her polished exterior faltering. "It was for our future," she said, her voice unconvincing. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of her betrayal became undeniable. Ethan felt a mix of vindication and sorrow. He had wanted the truth to come out, but seeing Vanessa unravel in front of him wasn't the victory he had imagined. Still, he knew this was a turning point, not just in the case, but in reclaiming his dignity. With the court ruling imminent, Ethan felt the tension in every fiber of his being. He spent his evenings working late in the workshop, creating a piece that had taken on new meaning, a large oak dining table, its design inspired by the concept of renewal. As he sanded the final surface, Ethan reflected on how far he had come. He was no longer the man who sought validation in Vanessa's approval. He had built something tangible, something that reflected his resilience. When the table was finished, Ethan placed it in the center of Paul's dining room. Paul walked in, his eyes widening. "This is incredible," he said. "You should showcase this at the next fair." Ethan smiled for the first time in days. "I think I will," he said, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The day of the final ruling arrived, and the courtroom was packed with tension. Ethan sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Vanessa avoided his gaze, her expression unreadable. The judge's voice cut through the stillness. "After reviewing all evidence and testimonies, it is clear that Mr. Davis has demonstrated his financial independence and personal integrity. The court finds in his favor, awarding him sole ownership of his business assets." Ethan exhaled sharply, relief washing over him. But the judge wasn't finished. Regarding the financial transfers made by Mrs. Davis, the court recognizes this as a breach of marital trust. Restitution will be required. Vanessa's face hardened, but she remained silent. Ethan glanced at her briefly, feeling a twinge of sadness for what they had lost. But as he stepped out of the courtroom, the weight he had carried for so long finally began to lift. After the verdict, Ethan returned to his workshop, now fully his own. The weight of the court battle had lifted, but the scars remained. He spent days immersed in his craft, creating pieces that reflected his journey, strength forged through adversity, beauty born from resilience. One piece, in particular, captured his emotions, a walnut bench with intricate carvings of intertwining branches. To Ethan, it symbolized growth after a storm, roots digging deeper despite being battered. When it was displayed at the artisan fair, it caught the attention of a gallery owner. "This is exceptional," the owner said, handing Ethan a business card. "We'd love to feature your work in an upcoming exhibition." Ethan hesitated, the remnants of self-doubt lingering. But he accepted, knowing this was the beginning of a new chapter. Ethan was setting up for the gallery exhibition when he noticed Vanessa among the crowd. She looked out of place, her usual confidence replaced with a tentative demeanor. Their eyes met briefly before she approached him. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft, "I heard about the exhibition and wanted to see your work." She paused, glancing at the carved bench on display. "It's beautiful." Ethan nodded, unsure of her intentions. "Thank you," he said, his tone polite but distant. "I've been thinking a lot," Vanessa continued, "about everything that happened. I know I hurt you, and I wanted to say I'm sorry." The apology was unexpected, and Ethan didn't know how to respond. "I've moved on, Vanessa," he said finally. "I hope you can too." Her expression faltered, but she nodded. As she walked away, Ethan felt a strange sense of closure, as if a door he hadn't realized was still open had finally shut. The gallery exhibition was a success. Ethan's pieces drew praise from critics and attendees alike, many of whom were moved by the stories behind his work. One visitor, a local journalist, approached him for an interview. "Your pieces have so much emotion," she said, her notepad in hand. What inspires you? Ethan hesitated, then smiled. Life, he replied. The challenges, the losses, and the lessons that come with them. The article that followed brought a surge of interest in Ethan's work. Orders poured in, and he began collaborating with other artisans, creating a network of craftsmen who supported and inspired one another. For the first time in years, Ethan felt not just successful, but truly fulfilled. As Ethan's business flourished, he looked for ways to give back to the community that had supported him. He began hosting workshops for aspiring woodworkers, sharing not only his skills but also his story. One of his students, a young man named Alex, reminded Ethan of himself, a quiet dreamer unsure of his place in the world. Ethan took Alex under his wing, encouraging him to embrace his talent. During one class, Alex approached Ethan with a question. "How did you keep going when things got hard?" he asked. Ethan thought for a moment before replying. "I realized that the only person who could define my worth was me. Once I stopped looking for validation from others, everything changed." On the anniversary of the court ruling, Ethan sat at his now thriving workshop, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The past year had been transformative, filled with growth, new opportunities, and a sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. He decided to mark the occasion by creating a piece for himself, a sleek coffee table with a hidden compartment, symbolizing the strength found in what's often unseen. As he sanded the final surface, Ethan felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for his successes, but for the hardships that had shaped him. That evening, Paul joined him for dinner at the workshop, a meal shared at the oak dining table Ethan had crafted months ago. "You've come a long way," Paul said, raising his glass in a toast. Ethan smiled. "I have," he said simply, the weight of his journey now a memory that no longer held him down. Ethan's work and story began to garner attention beyond the artisan community. Invitations to speak at events and share his journey poured in, from local community centers to prestigious conferences. At first, Ethan hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he'd ever envisioned himself doing. His first event was small, just a handful of people in a cozy bookstore. Ethan stood in front of the crowd, nervously gripping the edges of the podium. "I used to think my worth was tied to what others thought of me," he began, his voice shaky. "But I've learned that true strength comes from within, even when others can't see it." The audience listened intently, their nods and smiles encouraging him. By the end, Ethan felt lighter, as if sharing his story had lifted another layer of the weight he once carried. One morning, Ethan received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Vanessa's. He debated opening it but ultimately decided to read it. The letter was an apology, one more thoughtful than the brief words she had shared at the gallery. Vanessa admitted to her mistakes, acknowledging how her ambition had blinded her to the harm she had caused. "I see now how much I took you for granted," the letter read. "I hope you can forgive me, even if we can never go back to what we were." Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. It wasn't forgiveness he needed from Vanessa, it was the acknowledgement that he'd always been more than she gave him credit for. The closure he'd been seeking was already within him. Ethan's reputation as a craftsman and speaker continued to grow, and he was invited to present his work at an international artisan showcase. It was the largest event he had ever attended, with artists and creators from around the world. His booth featured his most recent pieces, each one inspired by a pivotal moment in his journey. A sleek wooden clock symbolized time lost and reclaimed, while a spiral staircase model represented growth and ascension. Visitors lingered, drawn not just to the craftsmanship but also to the stories Ethan shared. One attendee, a renowned designer, approached him with a proposition. "Your work tells a story," she said. "I'd like to collaborate with you on a special collection." Ethan accepted, excited by the opportunity to merge his vision with hers. The partnership marked a new phase in his career, one that expanded his reach while staying true to his roots. To celebrate his growing success, Ethan hosted an open house at his workshop. Clients, friends, and supporters filled the space, admiring his work and enjoying the community he had built. Paul, ever the supportive friend, raised a toast during the event. "Here's to Ethan," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "A man who proves that resilience, talent, and heart can turn any challenge into a masterpiece." The room erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. As he looked around, he saw not just the fruits of his labor but also the connections he had forged. It was a reminder that success wasn't just about achievements, it was about the people who supported him along the way. One quiet afternoon, Ethan returned to his workshop and found himself drawn to an old journal he had kept during his marriage. Flipping through the pages, he saw entries filled with self-doubt and frustration. It was like reading the thoughts of a stranger. Sitting at his desk, Ethan picked up a pen and wrote a new entry. This one wasn't about pain or loss, it was about growth and gratitude. He wrote about the lessons he had learned, the strength he had discovered, and the joy he now found in his work and life. As he closed the journal, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace. The chapter of his life that had once been defined by struggle and humiliation was now a story of resilience and triumph. Months after his open house, Ethan received an invitation to speak at a local high school. The request surprised him, but he accepted, seeing it as a chance to inspire the next generation. Standing in the school auditorium, he shared his story, focusing on resilience and the importance of self-worth. "There will always be people who underestimate you," he said, his voice steady. "But their opinions don't define who you are. You do." After his speech, a student approached him. She held a small sketchbook filled with intricate designs. "I've always wanted to be an artist," she said shyly, "but people say it's not a real career." Ethan smiled, recognizing a younger version of himself in her hesitation. "Don't let anyone take away your dream," he said. "Keep creating, no matter what." The interaction reminded him of how far he had come and how much his journey could impact others. Ethan decided to revisit the small town where he grew up, a place he hadn't seen since his early 20s. Walking through the familiar streets, he felt a mix of nostalgia and newfound clarity. He visited the workshop where his father had taught him the basics of woodworking. The space was now a dusty storage room, but the memories it held were vivid. Ethan ran his fingers over the worn tools left behind, remembering the lessons his father had imparted. Before leaving, he crafted a simple wooden plaque inscribed with the words, "For the dreamers who never stopped believing." He left it at the workshop's entrance, a silent tribute to his roots and the foundation that had shaped him. Ethan's collaboration with the renowned designer culminated in the launch of a limited edition furniture collection. The pieces, each inspired by resilience and transformation, were displayed in a sleek gallery in the heart of the city. The opening night drew a crowd of art enthusiasts and critics. Ethan stood by his creations, feeling a mix of pride and disbelief. Each piece bore a small inscription, a snippet of the story it represented. A journalist approached him during the event. "Your work is deeply personal," she said. "What drives you to share so much of yourself through your craft?" Ethan thought for a moment before replying, "Because it's in our struggles that we find our strength. If my work can remind someone of that, then it's worth sharing." The collection was a resounding success, solidifying Ethan's place as not just an artisan but a storyteller. Back at his workshop, Ethan reflected on the whirlwind of the past few years. The space, once filled with uncertainty and frustration, was now a haven of creativity and purpose. He began designing a new project, this time, a large installation for a community center. The piece would feature intertwined wooden beams, symbolizing unity and growth. As he worked, Ethan thought about the people who had supported him, from Paul to the clients who had believed in his vision. The installation became a communal effort, with volunteers helping to assemble it. On the day it was unveiled, the community gathered to celebrate. Ethan stood back, watching as people admired the piece, their expressions filled with wonder. It was a moment of connection and gratitude, one that reaffirmed his belief in the power of creativity to bring people together. On a crisp autumn morning, Ethan sat at his desk, surrounded by the tools and materials that had become his life's work. A new project waited in front of him, a commission for a children's library, but he paused, taking a moment to reflect. His journey had been anything but easy, but every challenge had shaped him into the person he was today. He no longer felt the need to prove his worth to anyone. Instead, he focused on creating, giving back, and living a life filled with purpose and authenticity. As sunlight streamed through the workshop window, Ethan picked up his tools and began working. The sound of the saw and the scent of wood filled the room, grounding him in the present. The next chapter of his story was just beginning, and for the first time, Ethan felt ready for whatever it would bring.